The cameras were rolling live at Lakewood Church when Victoria Osteen suddenly froze mid-sentence, her characteristic warmth and eloquence vanishing as she stared at Jonathan Roumie with an expression no one had ever seen on her face before. The co-pastor who had spoken to millions with unwavering confidence, who had authored books on finding your best life, who had stood beside Joel through decades of ministry, was now trembling as the actor who portrayed Jesus revealed something about her own past that she had never shared publicly, something so deeply personal and painful that it shattered every carefully maintained wall she had built around her heart. "Victoria, are you okay?" "We're still live," whispered her assistant from the side of the stage, but Victoria couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't do anything except process the impossible truth that this man, this actor she had just met hours ago, had somehow seen directly into the most hidden corner of her soul and spoken the one thing she had been running from for 20 years. The congregation of thousands sat in confused silence, many reaching for their phones to make sure the live stream hadn't frozen, while others began to realize they were witnessing something that transcended a typical church service. Jonathan stood quietly beside her, his hand extended but not quite touching her shoulder, his eyes filled with a compassion so profound it seemed to radiate through the entire sanctuary, and on his face was the gentle smile of someone who knew that what was about to happen next would change not just Victoria's life, but the lives of millions watching around the world. What Victoria didn't know was that her microphone was still on, and when she finally whispered the 3 words that came from the deepest place of her breaking heart, those words would be heard by every person in that building and every viewer watching the live stream, and within hours, those same 3 words would become the most shared moment in Christian media history, causing pastors across America to pause their own sermons to address what had just happened on that stage in Houston, Texas. The morning had begun like any other Sunday at Lakewood Church, with Victoria arriving early to review her notes for the special service they had planned. It was their annual Faith in Media celebration, where they honored artists and creators who were bringing the message of Christ to mainstream audiences. Jonathan Roumie had been invited as the keynote guest, his portrayal of Jesus in The Chosen having touched millions of lives worldwide, and Victoria had been excited to meet him. She had watched the series with Joel and their children, often moved to tears by Jonathan's performance, but she had no idea that this meeting would become anything more than a pleasant interview about his work. As Jonathan arrived at the church that morning, walking through the massive lobby with its soaring ceilings and fountain displays, staff members whispered excitedly about having the man who played Jesus in their building. Victoria's assistant had brought him to the green room where Victoria was finalizing her preparation, and when she walked in to greet him, something unexpected happened in that first handshake. Jonathan's eyes met hers with a depth of recognition that made her pause, as if he was seeing not the polished co-pastor of America's largest church, but something deeper, something she kept carefully hidden beneath her public persona. "Mrs. Osteen, it's an honor to be here," Jonathan said warmly, but there was something in his tone that made Victoria's heart skip. "Please, call me Victoria," she replied with her practiced smile, but even as the words left her mouth, she felt an unusual vulnerability she couldn't explain. They sat down for what was supposed to be a brief pre-interview discussion, just going over talking points and timing, but within minutes the conversation had drifted away from The Chosen and into something more personal. Jonathan had asked her a simple question about how she and Joel balanced the enormous responsibility of pastoring such a massive congregation, and Victoria had given her usual answer about faith, family, and staying grounded in God's Word. But Jonathan had looked at her with those penetrating eyes and said quietly, "That's the answer you've learned to give, Victoria, but what's the real answer? What does it cost you?" The question had landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples through her carefully constructed composure. No one ever asked her that. No one ever looked past the successful ministry, the beautiful family, the best-selling books, to ask what it actually cost her soul to maintain it all. Victoria had laughed it off, deflecting with humor as she always did, but something in Jonathan's gentle persistence told her that he wouldn't be easily redirected. Their conversation was interrupted by the worship team beginning their sound check, and Victoria excused herself to prepare for the service, but as she walked toward her office, she felt an unfamiliar trembling in her hands. There was something about Jonathan Roumie that unsettled her, not in a threatening way, but in the way that truth unsettles comfortable lies we've told ourselves for so long that we've forgotten they aren't real. In her private office, Victoria stood before the mirror and straightened her outfit, practicing her smile and her energy, the same ritual she had performed thousands of times before stepping onto that stage. But today, for reasons she couldn't explain, the woman in the mirror looked like a stranger, and for just a moment, Victoria allowed herself to feel the weight of exhaustion she had been carrying for 2 decades, the bone-deep tiredness of always being strong, always being positive, always being the image that millions needed her to be. She whispered a quick prayer asking God for strength to get through the service, never imagining that what she actually needed wasn't strength to maintain her walls, but courage to finally let them fall. The worship music filled Lakewood Church with its familiar power as 17,000 people sang with raised hands, their voices echoing off the curved ceiling of the former basketball arena that had become one of America's most recognized houses of worship. Victoria stood on the side of the stage, her heart still unsettled from the conversation in the green room, watching as Joel delivered his opening remarks with the warmth and encouragement that had made him a household name. When Joel introduced Jonathan Roumie, the congregation erupted in applause, many standing to honor the man who had brought Jesus to life on their television screens in a way they had never experienced before. Victoria walked onto the stage with her signature grace, embracing Jonathan warmly before settling into the comfortable chairs that had been arranged for their conversation, the massive screens throughout the arena displaying their images to every corner of the building. She began with easy questions, the kind she had asked hundreds of guests before, inquiring about how The Chosen had started, what it was like to portray Jesus, and how the show had impacted his own faith journey. Jonathan answered with humility and thoughtfulness, sharing stories about the cast becoming like family, about the prayers they prayed before each scene, about letters he received from people whose lives had been transformed by watching the show. The congregation listened with warm attention, many nodding along, some wiping tears as Jonathan described reading fan letters from people who had returned to faith after years of running from God. Victoria maintained her professional interviewing style, asking follow-up questions, laughing at the right moments, keeping the energy flowing exactly as she had done countless times before in similar conversations with Christian authors, musicians, and leaders. But those sitting in the front rows, those who knew Victoria well, began to notice something subtle in her demeanor, a slight tension in her shoulders, a forced quality to her smile that wasn't usually there. Jonathan was answering her questions with complete authenticity, but he kept redirecting the conversation back to her, asking what it was like to pastor alongside her husband, how she handled the criticism that inevitably came with such a public ministry, what brought her joy in the midst of such demanding work. Victoria deflected skillfully at first, turning each question back to him or to a general principle about faith and ministry, but Jonathan's gentle persistence continued, and the audience began to sense that this wasn't following the typical pattern of a celebrity church interview. During a planned video interlude showcasing clips from The Chosen, Victoria leaned toward Jonathan and whispered urgently, "Why do you keep asking me these personal questions? This interview is supposed to be about you and the show." Jonathan's response was soft but direct, his eyes holding hers with uncomfortable intensity. "I felt in prayer during worship that God was showing me you're carrying something heavy. Maybe today's the moment to finally let it go." Victoria felt her breath catch, her practiced composure cracking just slightly as she looked at this man she had met only an hour ago, this actor who was speaking to her with the authority of a prophet. The video ended and the cameras returned to them, and Victoria forced her smile back into place, asking Jonathan about his favorite scene to film, but her hands were shaking now, her voice slightly unsteady in a way that thousands of people watching the live stream were beginning to notice and comment about in real time on social media. Jonathan answered her question about the show, but then he did something unexpected. He reached across the space between their chairs and gently said, "Victoria, can I tell you what I see when I look at you?" The question hung in the air like electricity before a storm, and Victoria felt every defense she had carefully constructed over 20 years of public ministry beginning to tremble. She wanted to deflect, to laugh, to redirect to another question about The Chosen, but something in Jonathan's eyes held her captive, and she found herself nodding slowly, unable to stop what was about to happen even though every instinct screamed at her to maintain control. The congregation had grown completely quiet now, sensing that they were about to witness something far beyond a typical church service interview, and in the production booth, the director made a split-second decision to hold the cameras on Victoria and Jonathan instead of cutting to the planned worship transition, understanding somehow that what was unfolding on that stage was exactly what needed to happen. Jonathan leaned forward in his chair, his voice dropping to a tone that somehow carried throughout the entire sanctuary despite speaking barely above a whisper, a quality that made every person in that building lean forward as if drawn by an invisible thread. "Victoria, I see a woman who has spent 20 years making sure everyone else feels encouraged, everyone else feels hopeful, everyone else believes their best days are ahead of them, but you haven't allowed yourself to grieve the dream that died when you chose this path." The words landed like a physical blow, and Victoria's eyes widened in shock, her carefully maintained smile disappearing completely as she stared at Jonathan with a mixture of fear and recognition. No one knew about that. No one could know about that. It had been buried so deeply, so completely, that even she rarely allowed herself to remember it anymore. Her breathing became shallow and rapid, and Joel, standing at the side of the stage, took a step forward with concern etched on his face, but something stopped him from intervening. Jonathan continued, his voice filled with compassion rather than judgment. "Before all of this, before the church, before the cameras, before the books and the ministry, you had a different dream. You were going to be a musician, weren't you? Not just someone who led worship occasionally, but a real artist, creating music that came from the deepest places of your soul." Victoria's hand flew to her mouth as tears began streaming down her face, her composure completely shattered, and the congregation sat in stunned silence, many beginning to cry themselves without fully understanding why. "I was young," Victoria whispered, her voice breaking, barely audible even with the microphone. "I was foolish. It was a selfish dream." But Jonathan shook his head gently, his eyes never leaving hers. "It wasn't selfish, Victoria. It was the dream God planted in your heart before the weight of everyone else's expectations told you who you needed to be instead." The truth of his words cut through every excuse, every rationalization, every carefully constructed justification she had built over 2 decades. Victoria had been 23 years old when she married Joel, already knowing that his calling to ministry would require her to become someone different than the artist she had dreamed of being. She had buried her notebooks full of songs, packed away her guitar, and transformed herself into the pastor's wife that everyone needed her to be. And she had done it willingly, joyfully even, believing it was the right choice, the godly choice, the choice that honored her husband and her faith. But somewhere in the process of becoming who everyone needed, she had lost who she actually was, and the grief of that loss had been pushed down so far and for so long that she had convinced herself it didn't exist anymore. Jonathan's voice softened even further as he continued. "I know what it's like to bury who you really are, Victoria. Before The Chosen, I was a working actor taking whatever roles I could get, pretending to be happy with commercial work and small parts, telling myself that my dreams of meaningful art were prideful. I was so afraid of wanting too much, of being seen as selfish, that I almost let my calling die." The congregation was completely silent now, hanging on every word, many wiping away tears as they recognized their own buried dreams in this unexpected confession. Victoria looked at Jonathan through her tears, seeing not just an actor or a guest, but a fellow traveler who understood the specific pain of sacrificing your authentic self on the altar of others' expectations. "How did you find your way back?" she asked, her voice small and vulnerable in a way that millions of viewers had never heard from her before. Jonathan smiled gently, his own eyes glistening with emotion. "I had to stop believing that God's plan for my life was about making everyone else comfortable, and start trusting that the desires He placed in my heart were actually clues to my real calling, not obstacles to overcome." The words hung in the air like a revelation, and Victoria felt something shifting deep in her chest, a cracking of the concrete she had poured over her true heart so many years ago. "But the ministry," she whispered, gesturing vaguely at the enormous church around them, "all these people who need encouragement, who need hope, who need to see strength." Jonathan leaned even closer, his voice carrying the weight of prophetic authority. "Victoria, what if the greatest encouragement you could give them isn't your strength, but your honesty? What if the hope they really need isn't seeing you hold it all together, but seeing you brave enough to fall apart and trust that God catches you? The question shattered something fundamental in Victoria's understanding of her role, her calling, her very identity. In the production booth, the director watched the monitors with tears streaming down his face, completely forgetting about the planned schedule, the commercial breaks, the carefully timed segments. Phone calls were already flooding in from viewers reporting that something supernatural was happening through their screens, that they were feeling God's presence in their living rooms in ways they had never experienced before. Camera operators were wiping their eyes, sound technicians were frozen in place, and even the security staff stationed throughout the arena were visibly moved by what was unfolding on that stage. Victoria looked out at the congregation, at the thousands of faces watching her completely undone, and instead of shame, she felt something unexpected rising in her chest. Not the carefully managed vulnerability she sometimes shared in sermons, not the polished testimony that had been edited and refined for maximum impact, but real, raw, terrifying authenticity. "I'm so tired," she finally said, her voice breaking completely, speaking to Jonathan but loud enough for everyone to hear. "I'm so tired of being strong. I'm so tired of having the right answer. I'm so tired of being the example. I just want to be real." The admission hung in the air like a sacred offering, and 17,000 people held their breath, sensing they were witnessing the kind of moment that changes everything. If you believe God is calling you back to your authentic self, comment, "I'm listening" below. Jonathan stood up from his chair, a movement so unexpected that it caused a ripple of surprise through the congregation, and he extended his hand toward Victoria with an invitation that transcended the physical gesture. "Then be real, Victoria. Right now. Right here. Stop performing and just be." His words carried a challenge wrapped in compassion, and Victoria stared at his outstretched hand as if it represented a doorway she had been afraid to walk through for her entire adult life. The silence in Lakewood Church had become so profound that the sound of Victoria's microphone picking up her rapid breathing seemed amplified, and thousands of people watching in the building and online felt their own hearts racing in synchronization with hers. She took his hand and stood, her legs unsteady, and for a long moment they simply stood facing each other on that massive stage while the world watched. Then Jonathan spoke the words that would change everything, his voice carrying an authority that seemed to come from somewhere beyond himself. "Victoria, I believe God wants you to know that the dream you buried still matters to him. It's part of his plan for you. He gave you those songs, that creativity, that artistic soul, and when you buried it out of fear and obligation, a part of his plan got buried with it." Victoria's knees buckled slightly and Jonathan steadied her, his hand firm on her arm, his eyes holding hers with unwavering intensity. "But here's what you need to understand," he continued, his voice growing stronger. "God doesn't waste anything. Those 20 years of ministry weren't wrong. The path you chose wasn't a mistake. But it was only part of the story, not the whole story. And today, right now, he's inviting you to pick up what you laid down and discover that you don't have to choose between being a pastor and being an artist, because he created you to be both." The words hit Victoria like a tidal wave of truth, and she began to sob, not the delicate tears of a composed public figure, but the deep, guttural sobs of someone whose soul was finally being given permission to exist. Her shoulders shook, her perfectly styled hair fell forward, and she collapsed against Jonathan's shoulder as 20 years of suppressed grief poured out of her in front of 17,000 witnesses. The congregation erupted in spontaneous worship, some crying, others praying aloud, many rushing toward the stage with hands outstretched, and the sanctuary that had moments before been silent with anticipation now pulsed with the unmistakable presence of God moving through broken hearts. Joel Osteen stepped onto the stage, his own face streaked with tears, and wrapped his arms around his wife from behind, creating a protective circle with Jonathan as Victoria continued to break under the weight of divine permission to be whole. "I'm so sorry," Joel whispered into Victoria's ear, his voice caught by her microphone. "I never knew. I never asked. I just assumed you were happy with everything. I'm so sorry, Victoria." His confession added another layer to the moment, and throughout the arena, married couples began reaching for each other, recognizing their own failures to truly see their spouses in Joel's honest admission. Jonathan placed both hands on Victoria's shoulders, gently creating space so he could look into her eyes again, and when he spoke this time, his voice carried the unmistakable tone of prophetic declaration. Jonathan said softly, "I feel like God hasn't forgotten the songs you wrote in secret. I have not dismissed the melodies you hummed when you thought no one was listening. I have been waiting, so patiently waiting, for you to trust me enough to believe that I am big enough to hold all of who you are, not just the parts that feel safe to share." Victoria lifted her face toward the ceiling, her eyes closed, her mouth open in a silent cry, and what happened next would be captured on dozens of camera angles and shared millions of times across social media in the coming days. A sound emerged from her throat, wordless at first, then forming into a melody that seemed to come from the deepest cavern of her soul, a song that was both lament and liberation, grief and gratitude woven together in notes that had been trapped inside her for 2 decades. The melody was haunting and beautiful, completely unrehearsed, raw and imperfect, and absolutely transcendent. The worship team, without any direction or cue, began to softly play underneath her spontaneous song, their instruments finding the key and rhythm as if guided by invisible hands, and what had been a church service transformed into something ancient and holy, a moment when heaven and earth touched in the most unexpected way. Victoria sang words that came from somewhere beyond her conscious mind, lyrics about lost dreams and found grace, about the parts of ourselves we sacrifice and the God who never forgets them, about being brave enough to be whole even when wholeness looks different than anyone expected. The congregation joined her wordless melody, 17,000 voices humming and singing without words, creating a symphony of collective healing that transcended language and doctrine and religious performance. In living rooms and hospital beds, in cars and coffee shops, people watching the live stream fell to their knees as they felt God's presence crash through their screens like a wave breaking through a dam. Churches across America interrupted their own services to tune in, pastors weeping as they watched what was happening in Houston, youth groups gathering around phones to witness the moment when one of Christianity's most recognized faces chose authenticity over image. The phone lines at Lakewood Church had completely crashed from the volume of calls, social media was exploding with testimonies of people feeling God's presence, and in the production booth, every single crew member was on their knees praying or worshiping, their jobs completely forgotten in the weight of what was happening. When Victoria's song finally faded into silence, she opened her eyes and looked at Jonathan with an expression of wonder and gratitude and holy fear. "How did you know?" she whispered. "How could you possibly have known?" Jonathan smiled through his own tears, his hands still resting gently on her shoulder. "Because I believe Jesus sees what everyone else misses, Victoria, and sometimes he lets us glimpse it through moments like this. So I can remind his daughters and sons that they're allowed to be fully alive." The simplicity of his answer contained oceans of truth, and Victoria nodded slowly, understanding flooding her face. She turned to face the congregation, her makeup destroyed, her hair disheveled, her image completely shattered, and she had never looked more beautiful or more real. "I don't know what happens next," she said, her voice hoarse from crying and singing. "I don't know how this changes things or what it means for the ministry or any of it. But I know that something died here today, and something came back to life, and I think maybe that's what resurrection is supposed to look like." Her words landed like benediction and invitation, and throughout that building and across the world, people felt permission to excavate their own buried dreams, to grieve their own sacrificed selves, to believe that God was big enough to hold all of who they were created to be. Victoria walked to the edge of the stage, her eyes red and swollen, her voice still shaking but carrying a new authority born from vulnerability rather than polish, and she looked directly into the camera with an intensity that made millions of viewers feel as though she was speaking directly into their living rooms, their kitchens, their secret places of pain. If you're watching this right now and you're thinking that this doesn't apply to you because you're not a pastor or a public figure, I need you to hear me, she said, her words cutting through every excuse and deflection. Every single one of us has buried something that God never asked us to bury. Every one of us has sacrificed parts of ourselves on altars that God never built. And today, right now, He's giving you permission to dig up what you buried and bring it back to life. The congregation erupted in affirmation, thousands of voices calling out agreement, and across social media, The comments section exploded with confessions of abandoned dreams, suppressed callings, and authentic selves traded for acceptable versions. Jonathan joined Victoria at the edge of the stage, his presence calm and steady beside her renewed fire, and together they created an image of partnership in healing that resonated with viewers who had felt alone in their buried pain. "I want to speak specifically to the mothers watching," Victoria continued, her voice gaining strength. "The ones who gave up careers and creativity to raise children, who were told that sacrifice meant erasure, who believed that being a good mom meant killing every other part of yourself. God sees you. He hasn't forgotten the painter you used to be, the writer you dreamed of becoming, the entrepreneur whose ideas still wake you up at night. Your season of focused mothering was holy, but it doesn't have to be your whole story. You're allowed to have more than one chapter." Women throughout the building began weeping, standing, some literally crying out as decades of suppressed identity came rushing to the surface, and Victoria's assistant reported later that the prayer counseling lines received over 15,000 calls in the next hour from mothers who were finally giving themselves permission to dream again. Jonathan stepped forward, his actor's training giving him the ability to project both strength and gentleness simultaneously. "And I need to speak to the men who are watching, especially those in ministry or leadership positions," he said, his eyes seeming to look through the camera into the souls of viewers. "How many of you have created an image of strength that has become a prison? How many of you lead your families, your businesses, your churches from behind a mask of having it all together, terrified that if anyone saw your doubts, your fears, your struggles, everything would fall apart?" His questions hung in the air like an invitation to honesty, and in homes across the nation, men who had never cried in front of their families found tears streaming down their faces as they recognized themselves in his words. Joel Osteen, who had been standing quietly to the side, walked forward and put his hand on Jonathan's shoulder, his famous smile replaced with an expression of raw humility. "Jonathan's right," Joel said, his voice carrying the weight of personal testimony. "I've spent years trying to be the encouraging voice, the positive message, the hope dealer, and all of that is real and genuine. But what happened here today showed me that I stopped asking the hard questions. I stopped looking beneath the surface, even with the person I love most in the world. I let Victoria carry something alone because I was too focused on the growth of the ministry to notice the shrinking of her soul." His confession sent shockwaves through the arena, and within minutes, pastors across America began pausing their own services to confess similar failures, creating a domino effect of authenticity that would later be studied by church leadership consultants as a turning point in American Christianity. Victoria moved back to Jonathan's side, and together they created a visual representation of partnership in vulnerability that the cameras captured in a frame that would become iconic. "Here's what I've learned in the last 20 minutes, Victoria said, laughing through her tears. "God is not afraid of our complexity. He's not intimidated by our contradictions. He doesn't need us to be simple, one-dimensional characters in his story. He created us with layers and depths and multiplicity, and when we try to flatten ourselves into acceptable versions, we're actually insulting his creative genius." Her theological reframing of authenticity gave thousands of viewers the permission they needed to stop performing and start existing, and seminary professors would later point to this moment as an example of practical theology emerging from lived experience rather than academic theory. Jonathan nodded enthusiastically, his face glowing with the joy of shared revelation. "This is exactly what I've discovered playing Jesus in The Chosen," he added. "The more we showed his humanity, his complexity, his moments of frustration and joy and sorrow, the more people connected with him. Because perfect isn't relatable, and performative isn't transformative. It's the broken, honest, fully human Jesus who actually changes lives, not the sanitized Sunday school version we've created to make ourselves comfortable." The theological implications of his statement would spark discussions in Christian publications for months, but in that moment, it simply felt like truth breaking through layers of religious performance. Victoria addressed the camera again, this time with specific instruction. "If you're watching and you know exactly what you buried, I want you to do something radical right now. Get a piece of paper and write down what it was. The dream, the calling, the part of yourself you sacrificed. Write it down and then do something even more radical. Tell someone. Text a friend, call a family member, post it in the comments. Stop keeping it secret. Secrets keep us sick, but confession brings healing. Within seconds, the comment section became a digital confessional, thousands of viewers posting their buried dreams, and the sense of collective healing was palpable even through screens and distance. And if you don't know what you buried because it's been so long that you've forgotten, Jonathan added, his pastoral instincts evident despite not being a traditional pastor, ask God to show you. He remembers even when we've forgotten. He's kept every dream, every desire, every authentic impulse safe in his heart, waiting for the moment when you're brave enough to reclaim it. The invitation was both simple and profound, and prayer counselors later reported that this specific instruction led to more breakthrough conversations than any other moment in the service. Victoria and Jonathan stood together in silence for a moment, allowing the weight of what had happened to settle, and the cameras held on them in a frame that captured both strength and vulnerability, ministry and humanity, the sacred and the real existing in the same space without contradiction. In the 48 hours following that Sunday service, the video clip of Victoria's breakdown and spontaneous song became the most shared Christian content in social media history, accumulating over 200 million views across all platforms and sparking what would later be called the Authenticity Awakening. News outlets from CNN to Fox News covered the story with genuine curiosity, and secular commentators found themselves unexpectedly moved by the raw humanity they witnessed. Lakewood Church's phone lines remained overwhelmed for days as people from every denomination called requesting prayer, sharing their own stories of buried dreams, asking how to begin the journey back to authenticity. Victoria spent the week in what she described as holy disruption, canceling speaking engagements to sit with what had happened and listen to what God was calling her toward next. She pulled out boxes from storage that hadn't been opened in 20 years, finding notebooks filled with song lyrics, old recordings on cassette tapes, photographs of herself at 22 holding a guitar with eyes full of dreams she had convinced herself were selfish. Joel sat with her as she went through each item, asking questions he had never thought to ask before, learning about the woman he had been married to for decades but had never fully known. Their conversations became the foundation for a marriage retreat they would later lead, helping thousands of couples move beyond surface-level partnership into authentic intimacy. Jonathan returned to the Chosen set with a deeper understanding of his calling, and he received over 50,000 messages from people sharing how that moment at Lakewood had changed their lives. Pastors confessed their own performance-based ministry, artists returned to abandoned callings, parents recognized how they had projected their unlived dreams onto their children instead of pursuing their own healing. Churches across America began Resurrection Sundays, services dedicated to creating space for congregants to confess their buried dreams and receive prayer for courage to reclaim them. Denominational barriers dissolved as Methodist, Baptist, Pentecostal and non-denominational churches all participated in this unexpected movement toward authenticity. Mental health professionals reported a surge in clients seeking therapy to process the gap between their authentic selves and their performed selves. Victoria began writing music again, and 6 months later released an album titled Excavation that debuted at #1 on both Christian and mainstream charts. The song she had spontaneously sung that Sunday, titled Permission to Be Whole, became an anthem covered by artists across genres. Music critics who typically dismissed Christian music found themselves moved by the artistic integrity of her work, and Victoria discovered that her years of ministry had actually deepened her artistry in ways her 23-year-old self could never have achieved. Joel's preaching changed as well, becoming less about principles and more about process, less about victory and more about the messy middle where most people actually live. Attendance at Lakewood actually increased as people felt safe bringing their real selves to church instead of their performed selves, and other megachurch pastors began reevaluating their own ministries, realizing that authenticity attracted more than production value ever could. Perhaps the most profound impact came from countless individuals who said that watching Victoria's breakdown gave them permission to have their own, that seeing a respected leader admit exhaustion made them brave enough to admit their own weariness, that witnessing resurrection made them believe their own dead dreams might not be dead after all. Parents stopped pressuring children into predetermined paths and started asking what dreams God had planted in their hearts. pastors stopped equating strength with stoicism and started modeling vulnerability that creates real community. Artists stopped apologizing for their creativity and started offering it as worship. Victoria would later say that the moment on stage with Jonathan wasn't the end of her journey but the beginning, that learning to integrate all parts of herself was ongoing work requiring daily courage and constant grace. "I'm still learning," she admitted with a smile that comes from accepting rather than achieving. "I'm still figuring out how to be a pastor and an artist, a leader and a learner, strong and soft. But the difference now is that I'm not trying to choose anymore. I'm not trying to kill off parts of myself to make other parts acceptable. I'm just trying to show up whole and trust that God is big enough to use all of me." Perhaps you're reading this and recognizing yourself in Victoria's story, seeing your own buried dreams in her confession, feeling the weight of your own performance in her exhaustion. The beautiful truth is that what happened to Victoria can happen to you, not because you need a dramatic public moment or a prophetic actor, but because the same God who gave her permission to be whole is giving you that same permission right now. You don't have to be perfect, you don't have to be polished, you don't have to be anything other than courageously, beautifully, authentically yourself. When ordinary people make themselves available to an extraordinary God and brave enough to be real, miracles happen in the most unexpected places, and the world changes one honest heart at a time. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs permission to be whole, and comment below with the dream you've been too afraid to name, because your story matters, your authenticity matters, and the world is waiting for the real you to finally come alive.